My name is Nora Kessler. I have a master's in environmental chemistry from SUNY ESF and 4 years of field experience sampling contaminated surface water in central New York, mostly legacy industrial sites. Solvay waste beds, side discharges, chlor-alkali plant runoff, that kind of thing. When the state contracted me through Adirondack Environmental Associates to do quarterly monitoring at Drosser, I thought it was a gift. Most of my postings involved wading through reed-choked drainage channels with a dissolved oxygen meter, while contractors argued about whether they could bill for lunch. Drosser was different. 1 lake, 4 sample stations, a 12-foot aluminum skiff with a 9.9 Yamaha outboard. No wading, no contractors. Drive up from Syracuse, spend 1 full day on the water, process samples in the mobile lab I towed behind my truck, file the spreadsheets, go home. The first 2 quarters were exactly that boring. April and July of last year. I motored to the 4 GPS waypoints, lowered the Van Dorn sampler to the designated depths, filled the bottles, capped them, labeled them, packed them in ice. The water at Drosser is the color of rust cut with antifreeze. It doesn't smell like lake water. It smells like a penny left in vinegar overnight, metallic and sharp, with something underneath that's almost sweet in a way that makes your sinuses close. I wore nitrile gloves doubled, kept my sleeves down, and splashed nothing. You learn to be careful around water like that. It doesn't burn you on contact, but it'll eat through a pair of boots in a season, and the dermatitis reports from the original cleanup crews in the 90s were enough to make you religious about PPE. I didn't see anything unusual during those first 2 trips. The data came back as expected. Cadmium, arsenic, zinc, copper, all elevated, all consistent with historical readings. Dissolved oxygen at depth, effectively 0. Biological oxygen demand, not applicable. Chlorophyll, A, 0. You don't test for living indicators in a Class 5 lake, but the protocol still requires the columns on the spreadsheet, and I still entered 0 every time. The October sampling is where this starts. I launched the skiff at 6:40 a.m. from the gravel pullout on the east shore. Drosser doesn't have a boat ramp. It doesn't have a dock. There's a stretch of bank where the grade is shallow enough to back in a trailer, and that's it. There's no park. No signage except the yellow contamination warning that the county refreshes every spring. Nobody fishes at Drosser. Nobody swims. The lake sits in a bowl of second-growth birch and scraggly hemlock, and there's one access road that dead ends at the pullout. If you drove past it at 60 miles an hour, you'd think it was a pond. You wouldn't stop. I reached Station 1, the deepest point, near the center at 7:15. Water depth there is around 19 meters, which is deep for a lake that small. The pit goes down farther than you'd expect because Drosser isn't natural. It's a flooded open-pit feldspar mine from the 1940s. The mining company processed ore with sulfuric acid leaching on site, went bankrupt in 1961, and left the pit to fill with groundwater and rain. 40 years later, the state looked at what they had and realized the water was basically a dilute acid bath laced with every metal in the periodic table's bad neighborhood. I mention all of this because I need to be clear. The lake is dead, sterile. It had been tested dozens of times over decades. Nothing photosynthetic, nothing aerobic, nothing anaerobic at depth, except trace microbial signatures consistent with iron-oxidizing bacteria, which barely qualifies as life in any meaningful sense. When I say dead, I mean that the water at Drosser is hostile to biological complexity in a way that makes the Berkeley pit look like a koi pond. At Station 1, I lowered the Van Dorn to 1 meter depth, triggered the messenger weight, brought it up, and filled my bottles, normal. I lowered it again to 5 meters, normal. I lowered it to 10 meters, and something resisted. That's the only word for it. The cable went taut, before it should have. Not snagged, a snag on bottom structure feels different. Feels like the cable bites a fixed point, and you can work it free with lateral motion. This was resistance along the full length, as if the water at depth had thickened. I checked my depth sounder. The bottom read 19.4 meters. I was at 10. I pulled the sampler up, and the resistance released at around 7 meters, just stopped, like the cable had passed through a membrane. I should have noted this and moved on. It was probably a thermocline artifact. Dense water does exert more drag on sampling equipment. That's basic limnology. Drosser is meromictic. The layers don't mix seasonally, so there can be extreme density gradients. But I'd sampled this station twice before at the same depths and hadn't felt it. I marked the anomaly in my field notes, collected the sample from 10 meters on a second attempt with no resistance, and moved on to Station 2. The rest of the October sampling was unremarkable. I finished by 2 p.m., packed the cooler, trailered the skiff, and drove back to Syracuse. I processed the samples the next morning in the mobile lab. Every result was within expected range except one. The 10-meter sample from Station 1 had chlorophyll A. Not a lot. Not enough to indicate a bloom or anything resembling a functioning ecosystem. 14 micrograms per liter. In a healthy lake, that's moderate. In Drosser Lake, at a pH of 3.1, it was impossible. I ran it again. Same result. Ran the blank. Clean. Ran a split sample. 12.8 micrograms. I sat in the lab trailer staring at the readout and did the thing you're supposed to do when you get an anomalous result. I assumed I'd made an error, cross-contamination from a prior site. Inadequate decontamination of the sampler, condensation in the spectrophotometer. I wrote it up as a suspected QC artifact, flagged it in the spreadsheet, and submitted the report with the flag. My project manager, Cora Devane, called me 2 days later. She didn't call about the chlorophyll. She called about the cadmium. Your 10-meter Station 1 cadmium is down, she said. Way down. I pulled up the spreadsheet. She was right. The historical average at that depth was around 0.85 milligrams per liter. My October reading was 0.31. I hadn't caught it because I'd been fixated on the chlorophyll. Could be seasonal variation, I said. Dilution from fall rain input. Nora, the 1 meter and 5 meter are normal. Just the 10 is down. That's not rain dilution, that's depth specific. She asked me to do a supplemental sampling. One additional trip, one additional profile at Station 1, full dissolved metals suite plus extended biological indicators. She scheduled it for 2 weeks out. November 5th. I remember the drive up that morning. It had rained overnight, and the access road to Drosser was soft. The birches were bare. The lake looked different without foliage framing it, just this flat, rust-colored disk sitting in a gray bowl. No wind, no movement, no birds. There are never birds at Drosser. That's one of the things the old cleanup crews noted. Nothing flies over it. Even crows avoid the airspace directly above the water, as if the chemical signature rises high enough to register as a warning. I launched the skiff and motored to Station 1. I set up the profiling rig, a multi-parameter sonde that takes continuous readings as you lower it through the water column, measuring temperature, conductivity, pH, dissolved oxygen, and turbidity at every 1/10 of a meter. I also brought a plankton net, which felt absurd. You don't tow a plankton net in water that can dissolve copper. But Cora wanted biological indicators, and the protocol for biological indicators starts with plankton. I lowered the sonde. The profile was normal from the surface to 6 meters. At 6.3 meters, the turbidity spiked. Not a little, it went from 2.4 NTU to 38 NTU in less than half a meter. I was looking at the real-time display, and I actually said out loud, "What is that?" There was nobody to hear me. I kept lowering. Turbidity stayed elevated through 7 meters, peaked at 9 meters at 61 NTU, then dropped back to baseline by 11, a band. A discrete, three-dimensional band of particulate matter suspended between 6 and 11 meters in a lake that should not contain particulate matter. I brought the sonde up, rinsed it, calibrated again, lowered it a second time. Same profile. The band was real. Here's where I need to tell you about the plankton net, because this is where I first felt something that wasn't scientific curiosity. I fitted the net, a standard 6'4" micron mesh to a bridle, and lowered it on a handline to 8 meters, right into the middle of the turbidity band. I towed it laterally for about 30 seconds by idling the skiff forward, then hauled it up. The cod end of the net, the little collection jar, at the bottom was full. Not full of water, full of something. It was a deep olive green, almost black, with a consistency like thin yogurt. It didn't smell like the rest of the lake. It smelled organic, wet soil and iron, and something that reminded me of the way a greenhouse smells in August, living things working hard in closed air. I transferred the sample to a bottle and held it up against the gray sky. There were structures in it, not just particulate, structures. I could see, without magnification, what looked like filaments, fine, dark threads suspended in the slurry, some of them 2 or 3 centimeters long. They moved, not all of them. Some were stationary, but several were contracting and extending in slow, rhythmic pulses that had nothing to do with the motion of my hand. I was holding a bottle of living material pulled from the middle of a lake that should have been as biologically barren as battery acid. I capped it fast, and I stowed it in the cooler, and I sat on the middle bench of the skiff for probably 3 full minutes before I did anything else. My field notes from that moment say, in handwriting that I can see was shaking, sample collected 8/22, visible biological material, motile structures observed, not consistent with any expected finding. I collected the water samples for the dissolved metals suite, working fast. I wanted to be done. The curiosity was there, of course it was. I'm a scientist. Finding something alive in Drosser Lake was like finding a fish in a lava flow, but underneath, the curiosity was something else. I didn't identify it until I was back on shore loading the skiff onto the trailer. It was the feeling you get when you realize you've been in a room with something you didn't know was there. Not fear of what it is, fear of how long it was there before you noticed. I drove back to Syracuse with the samples in the cooler and the plankton sample in a secondary containment bag because I didn't trust the cap. In the mobile lab, I processed the metals suite first. Cadmium at 10 meters was down again, 0.27 this time, lower than October, but now zinc was down too, and copper and arsenic, all at the 10-meter depth. The 1 meter and 15-meter samples were unchanged. Something at that depth was pulling metals out of the water. I already knew what I was going to see under the microscope before I set up the slide, because the only biological mechanism that reduces dissolved metals at that rate is bioaccumulation, organisms absorbing the metals into their tissues. But I wasn't prepared for what the slide actually showed. The filaments I'd seen in the bottle were organisms. Or rather, they were one organism, a colonial structure. Under 100x magnification, each filament resolved into hundreds of cells arranged in long chains, like beads on a string, but the cells weren't uniform. They alternated between 2 types, a smaller, darker cell and a larger, translucent cell with a visible internal structure I couldn't identify. The chains branched, they interconnected. The whole sample was a single network. When I increased magnification, I saw that the translucent cells contained something that absorbed light in a way I'd never seen before. Not pigmented like chlorophyll, not crystalline like a diatom frustule. The best comparison I can make is that each cell looked like it contained a small, dark lens, a sphere of material denser than the surrounding cytoplasm, positioned off-center, oriented the same direction in every cell I examined. Every single one of those internal structures was oriented toward the top of the slide, toward the light source of the microscope. I rotated the slide 180 degrees. The structures didn't move. They were fixed within the cells. But when I moved the microscope's illuminator to come from below, I checked again an hour later, and they had shifted. Every one, pointing down now, toward the light. They were tracking the light source. I called Cora that night. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a long time, and then she asked me to send the slides and the remaining sample to the state lab in Albany. I did. I also kept a subsample, which I want to be honest about, because what happened later partly happened because I had that subsample. 4 days later, Cora called me into the AEA office in Syracuse. She wasn't alone. A man named Elliot Price was there. He introduced himself as a research liaison from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, the agency that ultimately managed the Drosser site. He was calm, professional, and he did something I'd never seen a state official do. He thanked me for reporting the anomaly quickly. That felt wrong. State officials don't thank you for creating work. Price told me the Albany lab had confirmed my findings. The organism was real. It was alive. It was not in any database they'd searched. It appeared to be a novel colonial prokaryote with photosensitive organelles that had no equivalent in known taxonomy. They were sending samples to Cornell and to SUNY ESF's biology department. But in the meantime, they wanted to increase my monitoring frequency at Drosser to monthly, and they wanted me to expand the biological sampling at every depth, at every station. I agreed. I was excited. This was the kind of discovery that makes a career. You find a new extremophile in a dead lake. You publish the paper. You present at conferences. You get your name on something permanent. I want to be honest about that excitement because it's important to what comes later that you understand I wasn't suspicious yet. I was motivated. I was eager. I went back to Drosser 3 weeks later on a schedule that wasn't even fully approved yet because I wanted to see if the band had changed. It had. The turbidity band that had existed between 6 and 11 meters in early November now extended from 4 meters to 13 meters. It had nearly doubled in vertical extent in 3 weeks. And the plankton net came up heavier, not a little heavier. I had to haul it with both hands. The cod end was packed with the same dark green material, but denser now, and the filaments were longer. Some of them were 10 centimeters. I could see, with my naked eyes in overcast daylight, that they were moving. Slow, deliberate contractions. Not random. Rhythmic, like breathing, except the rhythm wasn't constant. It would speed up when I tilted the bottle and slow down when I held it still. The organism was responding to physical disturbance. I collected everything Cora and Price wanted. Full metals suite, full biological panel, water column profile, sediment grab, even an acoustic scan of the water column using a portable fish finder that I'd brought as an improvised tool because nobody makes scientific instruments for mapping biological density in a dead lake. The fish finder showed the band as a solid return, a dark horizontal stripe across the screen at mid-depth, thick enough to look like a false bottom. The instrument interpreted it as structure. It thought the organism was the lake floor. I went home that night and processed samples until 2A meant. Metals at depth were dropping across the board now, not just at Station 1. Stations 2, 3, and 4 all showed depressed metal concentrations at mid-depth. The organism had spread laterally across the entire lake. In 3 months, it had gone from an undetectable anomaly to a lake-wide presence. I should tell you about the subsample I'd kept from November. I had it in a sealed glass jar in my lab trailer, sitting on a shelf under the fluorescent lights. I hadn't done anything with it. I was saving it as a reference. When I got back from the late November sampling trip, I checked on it. The material inside had grown. Not a lot, maybe 15% more volume than when I'd sealed it. The jar was closed, airtight. There was no nutrient input, no gas exchange, no light cycle beyond the overhead fluorescence. The organism had grown on nothing, or on something I couldn't identify. When I picked up the jar, the filaments contracted, all of them, simultaneously, in a single pulse that took maybe half a second. Then they relaxed. Then they were still. I put the jar back, and I didn't pick it up again. The December trip was when the other people arrived. I drove up to Drosser on December 12th and found 3 vehicles at the pullout: a deck truck, a white panel van with Cornell plates, and a black SUV with federal tags. There were 7 people on the shore, including Elliot Price. He introduced me to Dr. Lian Zhao from Cornell's microbiology department, 2 of her graduate students, and 2 men from the EPA's Office of Research and Development who gave first names only Paul and Simmons. They'd launched a second boat, a rigid inflatable, bigger than my skiff, with a sonar array mounted to the transom and what looked like a remotely operated underwater camera on a winch. They had a portable generator running on the bank and a command tent with 3 laptops. I was not upset about this. I want to be clear. I was glad. More eyes, better instruments, proper institutional attention. This was exactly what an anomalous finding should trigger. What unsettled me was the timeline. Price had told me in November that he was sending samples to Cornell and ESF. It had been 4 weeks. In 4 weeks, the DEC had mobilized a multi-agency field team with specialized equipment to a lake that, 6 months ago, wasn't even on their active monitoring priority list. I've worked with the DEC for 4 years. They do not move that fast. Not for a new microbe. Not for anything short of an imminent public health threat. I asked Price, while the others were setting up, whether there was something about the organism that warranted this level of response. He looked at me with an expression I'd later learned to recognize as the face of someone deciding how much truth to trade for continued cooperation. "The growth rate," he said. "It's faster than anything in the literature." I noticed. "No, Nora, you noticed it in one lake. We've been checking other Class 5 sites upstate since your report. Gilboa Pit, the Tahawas Tailings Pond, Benson Mine Pool." I waited. "It's in all of them." I don't remember what I said to that. I might not have said anything. 4 separate dead water bodies, some of them 50 miles apart, with no hydrological connection, all containing the same organism that hadn't been there 6 months ago. That's not colonization. That's not dispersal. That's either the fastest spreading invasive event in microbiological history, or it was already everywhere, waiting, and something triggered it to become detectable at the same time. Dr. Zhao's team spent the morning doing what I'd been doing at a level of sophistication I couldn't match. They profiled the water columns centimeter by centimeter. They deployed the camera. They collected samples with equipment designed for deep-sea extremophile research. I worked alongside them at my own sampling stations, doing my standard protocol, feeling simultaneously validated and outpaced. At 11:30 a.m., one of Zhao's graduate students, a woman named Tess, called everyone over to the command tent. She had the camera feed up on the largest laptop. The camera was at 8 meters, pointed horizontally into the turbidity band. In a normal lake, at that turbidity level, you'd see a green murk and nothing else. This was different. The filaments were visible. Thousands of them, suspended in the water column, each one 10 to 30 centimeters long, branching and interconnecting in a 3-dimensional web that filled the frame. They were moving in unison, The rhythm I'd seen in my sample bottles was happening at macro scale, the entire network contracting and relaxing together, like a single organism breathing. Then Tess pointed at the bottom of the frame and said, "Watch." A filament drifted into view that was different from the others. It was thicker, and where the others were olive green, this one was almost black. It moved independently, not in rhythm with the network, but through it, weaving between the other filaments like a thread being pulled through fabric. As it passed, the surrounding filaments contracted away from it, creating a visible corridor, then relaxed back into position behind it. "We've been watching these for an hour," Tess said. "They circulate, always moving. The network parts for them and closes behind them." "What are they?" I asked. Dr. Zhao answered from behind me. "We don't know yet, but they don't have the same cell structure as the colonial filaments. They're denser. They absorb more light, and there are exactly as many of them at every depth within the band. The distribution is perfectly uniform." "That's not possible." "I know." The December trip lasted 2 days. I stayed at a motel in Speculator and drove back to the site each morning. On the second day, I noticed something that nobody else mentioned, and I've thought about it every day since. The fish finder I'd used in November showed the organism band as a dark stripe at mid-depth. In December, with the same instrument, the band was still there, but it was denser at the edges, a bright return at the top of the band around 4 meters, and at the bottom around 14, with a slightly lighter return in the middle. The organism had developed a structure, not just a uniform cloud, a defined boundary, an inside and an outside. I didn't tell anyone. I wrote it in my field notes, and I told myself I'd mention it in my report, but I didn't mention it to the people at the site. I'm not sure why. I think I was starting to feel something that I mistook for professional caution, but was actually the beginning of a much simpler instinct. The feeling that this information should be handled carefully. That saying it out loud, there, would start something I couldn't control. I recognize now that this was probably the same instinct that made Price hesitate before telling me it was in other lakes. The instinct to ration the truth. I'm not proud of it, and it matters later, so I'm telling you. January's sampling trip was mine alone. The multi-agency team wasn't there. They were coordinating a larger response that I was only partially briefed on. I went to Drosser on January 9th. The lake was frozen, or rather, the surface was frozen. This was normal for January in the Adirondack foothills. What was not normal was the color. Drosser's ice should have been the same rust orange as the water. When acidic, metal-laden water freezes, the ice incorporates enough dissolved material to tint it. I've seen it at other sites. Drosser's ice in January was dark green, almost black in places. The organism had reached the surface. I didn't take the skiff out. You can't launch on ice. I walked out instead, which was risky and stupid, and I did it anyway because I needed the samples. I drilled through the ice with a hand auger at my Station 1 GPS coordinates. The ice was 14 centimeters thick, and it was saturated with the filaments. As the auger bit through, the shavings that came up were laced with dark threads. They moved on the ice. Slowly, in the cold, but they moved. I dropped a weighted sample bottle through the hole on a handline. At the surface, the water was the usual rust color. Below 1 meter, it was green. By 2 meters, my handline was coming up coated in a thin film of biological material that I had to wipe off my gloves between each deployment. I collected what I needed, and I walked back to shore, and it wasn't until I was sitting in my truck with the heater running that I looked at my boot prints on the ice and saw that they were filling in. Not with snow, not with slush, with the filaments. The organism was growing into the voids my boots had compressed in the ice. I watched, from 50 meters away in my truck, as my tracks slowly turned from white to green over the course of about 20 minutes. Then I drove home. I called Cora. I called Price. I called Dr. Zhao. Nobody answered. I left messages. Price called back 4 hours later and told me, in a voice that sounded like he'd been awake for a long time, that the Gilboa pit organism had reached the surface too, and the Tahawas pond. All of them, all at once, as if they were keeping the same schedule. He told me a federal interagency working group had been convened, and that my Drosser contract was being transferred from the DEC to the EPA, and that I'd be contacted by someone from the EPA's Emergency Response Division within the week. Elliot, I said, what's the growth rate? He told me. I wrote it down. I've looked at the number many times since. The organism was doubling its biomass every 11 days. That number doesn't mean much by itself, so let me contextualize it. The fastest growing known prokaryote in optimal lab conditions can double in about 20 minutes. But that's a single-celled organism in a petri dish with unlimited nutrients. A colonial macrostructure, something that builds a three-dimensional network across an entire lake, doubling every 11 days, in water with a pH of 3.1, with no apparent nutrient source, at winter temperatures. That's not fast. That's not even biologically aggressive. That's something else. That's an organism that isn't constrained by the things that constrain organisms. The EPA contact came 3 days later. Her name was Renee Okafor. She was calm in the way that emergency responders are calm not because they aren't worried, but because worry is unprofessional. She told me my sampling contract was now part of a federal monitoring effort spanning 11 sites in 4 states. 11. In November, it had been 4. She told me I would continue my quarterly schedule at Drosser, but would also participate in a bi-weekly data call with the working group. She told me, as if it were a routine administrative matter, that my findings at Drosser were now classified as sensitive, but unclassified under a DHS information sharing framework, and that I should not discuss them outside the working group without clearance. I said yes. I signed what they asked me to sign. I joined the data calls, and I want to tell you what I learned on those calls, because it changes the shape of what I've been telling you so far. The organism wasn't just in dead lakes. It was in dead lakes first, the Class 5 sites, the abandoned pits, the toxic waste pools. Those were where it appeared first and grew fastest. But by January, it had been detected in 3 Class 3 lakes and 1 Class 2 lake in the same regions. Living lakes, lakes with fish and plankton and functional ecosystems. It was moving from the dead water into the living water. And here's what was happening when it arrived. The living water was getting cleaner. Not metaphorically, not a little. The metal concentrations were dropping. The pH was rising. Dissolved oxygen was increasing. In 2 of the Class 3 lakes, fish populations had measurably increased in the fall survey compared to the spring. A lake in Vermont, that had been on the state's impaired waterways list for 15 years, was being recommended for delisting because its water quality had improved so dramatically that it no longer met the criteria for impairment. The organism was eating the poison. I need you to sit with that for a second, because I had to sit with it for a lot longer, and it's the hinge of everything that comes after. The novel extremophile that was spreading through the waterways of the northeastern United States at a rate that alarmed every agency tracking it was, by every measurable standard, making the water better. It was bioaccumulating heavy metals. It was neutralizing acidity. It was creating oxygen. It was doing, for free and without infrastructure, what $400 million of remediation couldn't do at Drosser Lake alone. The February data call was the first time someone on the working group used the word beneficial. It was a limnologist from UVM named Dar. He said it carefully, the way you handle a word that might detonate. If we set aside the growth rate and the taxonomic novelty, the observable effects are uniformly beneficial. Nobody responded for about 10 seconds. Then Renee Okafor said, "That's noted," and moved to the next agenda item. I went to Drossa on February 20th. The ice was still there, but it was thinner than it should have been for mid-February, and the color had changed again. It was lighter now, greener, but a translucent green, like sea glass. When I augured through, the water underneath was clear, not rust-colored, not orange, clear, with a faint green tint and a pH, when I tested it on site, of 5.9. In 4 months, the organism had raised the pH of Drossa Lake by nearly 3 full units. That is, in chemical terms, 1,000-fold reduction in acidity. The metals were plummeting. The cadmium, that had been 0.85 milligrams per liter in July, was now 0.04, below the cleanup standard, below the drinking water standard. I filled my sample bottles, and I noticed that my hands weren't shaking the way they had been the last few times. I noticed that I was smiling. I noticed that the lake, which had looked and smelled and felt like a wound in the earth for as long as anyone had monitored it, now looked like a lake. A real lake. The kind you'd bring your kids to. And then I noticed the boat. Not my skiff, which was on the trailer on shore. A boat on the lake, on the ice, except there wasn't ice where it was. There was a circle of open water, maybe 40 meters in diameter, near the center of the lake, and in the middle of the open water was a small aluminum boat, a John boat, flat-bottomed, and there was nobody in it. I don't mean nobody visible. I mean I could see the entire boat. It was close enough, and the air was clear enough, and the boat was small enough that I could confirm there was no person on board, no motor, no oars, no equipment, just a bare aluminum hull sitting motionless on water that shouldn't have been liquid. I hadn't heard a vehicle arrive. My truck was the only one at the pullout. There were no tracks in the snow leading to the shore other than mine. The boat was just there. I stood on the ice with my sample bottles in the cooler at my feet, and I watched the boat for 10 minutes. It didn't move. The water around it didn't move. The circle of open water had a clean edge ice on one side, liquid on the other, with no slush transition, as if something had drawn a boundary. I walked closer. I know. But I walked closer, and when I got to within about 20 meters of the open water's edge, I stopped because I could see into the water around the boat, and the water was full. The filament network was visible from above. It was dense enough now that it looked like a submerged fabric, a green-black textile stretched across the full diameter of the open circle, maybe a meter below the surface. The dark, independent filaments that Tess had pointed out on the camera feed in December were there too, dozens of them, circulating through the network in their slow, deliberate paths. And they were arranged in a pattern. Not random circulation. A pattern. From above, looking down through the clear water, the dark filaments traced lines that converged on a point directly beneath the empty boat. I took photographs. I have them. I've submitted them to the working group, and they are part of the record. In the photographs, you can see the boat, the open water, the network below the surface, and the convergence pattern of the dark filaments. What you can't see, because cameras don't capture it, is the sound. There was a sound coming from the open water. Low, continuous, not mechanical. It was in the register you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. A hum, but not a steady hum it modulated. It rose and fell in intervals that weren't regular, but weren't random either. It sounded, and I am being as precise as I can, like something breathing very slowly and trying to match the rhythm of something else. I left. I walked back to the truck, and I drove to Speculator, and I sat in the motel parking lot, and I called Renee Okafor. "There's a boat on the lake," I said. "What kind of boat?" "An aluminum John boat, empty. No motor, no oars. It's sitting in an open water circle in the middle of the ice." "Renee, there's no way anyone put it there. There's no access. There's no second vehicle. And the organism is arranged underneath it in a pattern." She didn't ask me to describe the pattern. She asked me to send the photographs. I did. Then she said something I didn't understand at the time. "Is there a registration number on the hull?" I looked at the photos. I'd taken one close enough to read it if there had been a number. There was no number, no registration, no HIN, no markings of any kind. The hull was bare, clean, aluminum, no scratches, no oxidation, no wear. "It's new," I said. "Renee, the boat looks brand new." "It's not a boat," she said. And then she said she'd call me back, and she hung up. She called back 3 hours later. She was no longer calm. "Nora, I need you to listen carefully. We have a report from the Tahawas site that a structure appeared in the water overnight. Not a boat. They're describing it as a frame. Aluminum tubes, arranged in a rectangular shape, floating on the surface. A frame. At Gilboa, it's a different shape. Something like a trough. Also aluminum. Also with no markings and no way to explain how it got there. The organism is making them." She didn't confirm that. She said, "We're not ready to characterize the mechanism." But I could hear it in her voice. She already knew. The organism that was cleaning the water, that was eating the poison, that was turning dead lakes into living ones, was now producing solid structures on the surface of the water. It was building things. The March data call was the longest one. 46 participants, DEC, EPA, USGS, Fish and Wildlife, DHS, NSF, and 3 university labs. The briefing packet was 90 pages long, and I read every page, and I'm going to tell you the parts that matter. The organism had been detected in 41 water bodies across 7 states. Every documented occurrence followed the same progression. Appearance in the most contaminated water. First, rapid remediation of water chemistry. Expansion into connected and nearby water bodies. And in the 7 sites where it had been present, longest surface structures. The structures were not identical across sites, but they shared characteristics. All were metallic. Spectral analysis confirmed the metal composition matched the dominant dissolved metals at each site at Drosser, where cadmium was the primary contaminant. The boat was primarily cadmium. At a copper-contaminated site in Vermont, the structure was copper. The organism was pulling metals from the water and assembling them into solid objects at the surface. The objects were not random. They were, in the assessment of a materials scientist from Rensselaer Polytechnic who had been brought in to examine the Gilboa structure, fabricated. Her word. The metal showed crystalline regularity, consistent with controlled deposition, not with biological mineralization. It wasn't precipitated. It wasn't excreted. It was built, atom by atom, into shapes with flat surfaces and consistent angles and structural integrity. And the shapes were recognizable. That was the part of the briefing packet that I read 3 times. The shapes were human objects, a boat, a frame, a trough, at a site in New Hampshire, a chair, at a site in Pennsylvania, a simple table, 30 inches high, with 4 legs and a flat top, sitting on the surface of an acid mine drainage pond, made entirely of zinc. The organism was building human objects out of the poison it was cleaning from the water. Nobody on the data call used the word intelligent. Nobody said communication. The RPI material scientist called the objects structured precipitates with morphological parallels to anthropogenic and forms. Dar, the UVM limnologist, called them convergent geometries. Everyone was reaching for language that would let them describe what they were seeing without saying what they were seeing. I said it on the call. I unmuted and I said, "It's making things it thinks we'll recognize." Nobody responded. After about 5 seconds, the call moderator said, "Let's table that interpretation and move to the growth projections." The growth projections were this. At current doubling rates, the organism would be present in every surface water body in the northeastern United States within 14 months. It would reach the Great Lakes, watershed by summer. It would be in the Mississippi, drainage by fall, the Gulf of Mexico by winter. Every lake, every river, every reservoir, every municipal water supply that draws from surface water, all of it would contain the organism within 2 years. And the water, everywhere it went, would be cleaner. This is the part that I need you to understand, because it's the part that broke the working group into factions that haven't reconciled, and, as far as I know, never will. One faction led by Okafor and supported by the EPA and DHS representatives wanted to attempt containment. Physical barriers, chemical treatment, UV sterilization of waterways connecting contaminated sites to clean ones. Their argument was simple. An uncontrolled organism of unknown origin spreading through the national water supply is a threat regardless of its observable effects. You don't let something you can't identify colonize your drinking water because it seems helpful. The history of invasive species is a history of things that looked beneficial until they weren't. The other faction, led by Dar and supported by most of the university researchers, argued that containment was not only impractical at this scale, but potentially catastrophic. The organism was remediating sites that had been on the Superfund list for decades. It was doing what billions of dollars and centuries of engineering couldn't do. And it was doing something else. The water bodies it had colonized were developing ecosystems. Fish were returning to lakes that hadn't supported life in 50 years. Migratory birds were landing on water that used to kill them on contact. Drosser Lake, which had been a dead pit filled with acid, was becoming a lake again. If they killed the organism, they'd be killing the most effective environmental remediation agent ever observed. They'd be choosing the dead lakes over the living ones. I want to tell you what I thought at that point in March, because my position has changed since then, and I think the change matters. In March, I was with Dar. Not enthusiastically, I had too many unanswered questions, but functionally, the organism scared me, but the data was unambiguous. It was fixing things. It was making water safe that hadn't been safe in my lifetime. And the structures, the objects, yes, they were strange, but they weren't threatening. A boat, a chair, a table. These aren't weapons. These aren't traps. These are, if you interpret them, the most generous way possible, offerings. A thing from the water, presenting the creatures it shares the surface with objects it has observed them using, saying, "I see you. I know what you are. Here." I drove to Drosser on March 15th. The ice was gone. The lake was open, and it was green. A deep, vibrant, living green. And there were birds on it. Canada geese. 4 of them. Sitting on the surface of a lake that had killed a flock of starlings by chemical exposure in 2019. The geese were fine. They were feeding. The boat was still there. But it wasn't alone anymore. There were 5 objects on the water now. The original boat, plus what I can only describe as approximations. A second boat, slightly different in shape. Something that looked like a dock section, a flat platform, about 2 meters by 3 meters, floating flush with the surface. and two objects I didn't recognize. Curved, tapered shapes, about a meter long, that floated vertically with most of their mass below the waterline. I launched my skiff and motored out. I followed my sampling protocol. The water was clear enough now that I could see the filament network below me as I moved, and I could see the dark circulator filaments moving through it. And I could see that the network was denser than in February, denser and more organized. It looked architectural, layered, like a city seen from the air, with thoroughfares and districts and open spaces. I approached the original boat. Up close, it was flawless. The gunwales were smooth. The seats, it had 2 bench seats, were level and solid. I touched it. The metal was warm, not sun-warm, warm like a living thing, like something with a metabolism generating heat. And when I touched it, the sound started again, the chest-deep hum from February, but louder now and closer. And this time I could feel it through the hull of my own skiff, transmitted through the water into the aluminum, into my feet, into my bones. The hum modulated. It rose, held, dropped, rose again. And the pattern, I know this sounds, the pattern matched my breathing. I was breathing fast because I was scared, and the hum was fast. I forced myself to slow down. Deep breath in, slow breath out. The hum slowed to match. I took my hand off the metal boat. The hum continued for about 10 seconds, then faded. I collected my samples. I processed them on shore. The water quality at Drosser now exceeded every standard for recreational use. In 6 months, the organism had turned a Superfund-grade toxic pit into something you could swim in. The metals it had removed were accounted for, molecularly, in the structures it had built. I filed my report. I joined the next data call. I learned that containment had been attempted at 2 sites and had failed. The organism grew through physical barriers and was unaffected by any chemical treatment that didn't also destroy the water body. I learned that 23 new sites had been confirmed. I learned that the structures were becoming more complex. At a site in Maine, the organism had built something that a structural engineer described as a footbridge. It spanned a 6-meter gap between the shore and a rock outcrop. It was load-bearing. A member of the field team had walked across it. I also learned, on that call, the thing that changed my position. A molecular biologist from Johns Hopkins, brought in to analyze the organism's genome, or whatever passed for a genome in something that didn't fit neatly into any domain of life, had completed a preliminary sequence analysis. She presented her findings in the careful, hedged language of someone who knows she's about to say something that will make people question her competence. The organism did not have DNA. It did not have RNA. Its genetic material, the molecular structure that encoded its growth patterns, its metabolic pathways, its ability to build solid metal structures out of dissolved contaminants, was a nucleic acid analog that used a different sugar backbone than any known biological molecule. It was not related to any life on Earth. Not distantly, not anciently, not at all. The organism was not from here. I want to be careful about what I mean by that. The Johns Hopkins researcher did not say alien. She said xenonucleic acid, and no phylogenetic relationship to any terrestrial domain. She said the organism's biochemistry was as different from Earth life, as Earth life is from pure chemistry. She said it was alive, by every functional definition, but that it had not evolved from the same origin as anything else alive on this planet. And it was in 41 water bodies and spreading. And it was cleaning the water. And it was building things. The room, the virtual room. The call went silent. Then someone from DHS said, "This is now a national security matter." And the call ended. 3 things happened in quick succession after that. First, the working group was restructured. Half the participants, including Da and most of the university researchers, were removed. The remaining group was smaller, more federal, and operated under a stricter classification. I was kept on because I was the field sampler at the longest monitored site. Second, I was told by Renee Okafor in a call that she made from a number I didn't recognize that physical interaction with the structures was now prohibited. No touching, no sampling, no approach within 10 meters. She didn't explain why beyond citing precautionary protocol. Third, I got an email from Dr. Zhao's graduate student from the December field trip that I almost deleted because it was sent from a personal Gmail account with no subject line. The body of the email was one paragraph. They're not telling you about the Adirondack Lake. There's a site they're not including on the calls. It's older than Drosser. The structures there are more advanced. Someone on the team found writing. I didn't respond. I sat with that email for 2 days. Then I did something I shouldn't have, that I'd been told not to do, that I knew was a violation of the agreements I'd signed. I searched the DEC's internal surface water monitoring database, which I still had access to through my contractor credentials. I searched for recent sampling activity at undesignated sites in the Adirondack region. The database is big and messy and not designed for the kind of search I was running, but I found it. An unnamed lake, no site ID, coordinates placing it about 30 miles northeast of Drosser, deep in the Adirondacks, in a part of the park with no roads and no trails. It had been sampled 12 times since October monthly, then bi-weekly, then weekly. The sampling crew was listed as EUSEPA ER7, which is an emergency response team designation. The data was restricted. I couldn't see the results, but I could see the sample labels because the labeling system pulls from a different database tier than the results. And one of the sample labels, from a collection on February 28th, was tagged with a material code I'd never seen before. Bio struct inska. Biological structure, inscribed. I want to tell you what I did next, and I want to tell you why. I drove to the coordinates. I drove as close as I could get on forest roads, and then I hiked 7 miles through March snowpack with a day pack and my field sampling kit. I did this because I'm a scientist, and someone told me there was data I wasn't being shown, and because the thing I was studying was not from this planet and was building objects in our water and apparently writing on them, and I feel that hiding that information from the people whose water it's colonizing is wrong. I want to also tell you that I was afraid, not of the organism, of being caught, of losing my clearance, my contract, my career, of being the person who violated classification on a national security matter because a grad student sent me a Gmail. I hiked in with my heart pounding, and not because of the elevation. The lake was small, maybe 3 hectares. It sat in a granite bowl below a ridgeline, fed by snowmelt, and it was, I need to find the right words, it was beautiful. I've worked on contaminated water for 4 years. I've seen the ugliest things human industry can do to a landscape. This lake was the most beautiful body of water I've ever seen. The color was a deep emerald green, perfectly clear, and the surface was still, and on the surface there were structures. Not 5, not 10, dozens, maybe 50 objects, spread across the water, some floating, some extending from the water onto the shore rocks. Boats and frames and platforms and things I didn't have names for, curved shapes, stacked shapes. Lattice structures that rose a meter above the waterline and caught the light in ways that made them look like they were made of glass, except they were metal, copper, mostly, from the color. The organism had remediated whatever was in this water and built an entire field of objects out of what it removed. And on the largest platform, a flat sheet of metal, maybe 4 meters square, resting on the surface near the center of the lake, there were marks. I couldn't read them from shore. I had binoculars. Through the binoculars, I could see that the marks were regular, repeated, organized in rows. They were etched into the metal surface. They were not any alphabet I recognized. They were not decorative. They had the visual density and structure of text. Something not from this planet had cleaned a dead lake, built a table out of the extracted poison, and written something on it. I stood on the shore of that lake for a long time. I took photographs from every angle my binoculars could resolve. And I felt something I want to describe accurately because it's the center of what I'm trying to tell you. I did not feel afraid of the organism. I felt afraid of the people who were hiding it. 'Cause I stood there and I looked at a lake that something had healed and furnished, and then apparently tried to speak from, and the response of my government had been to classify it, not to study it publicly, not to bring in linguists, not to answer, to build a fence around the conversation and staff it with people whose job is to keep information from moving. The organism was reaching out. That's what the structures were. Not offerings, not demonstrations, attempts. Each object a closer approximation of something we'd understand. Each site a new attempt. And the writing, the inscribed structure, was the latest iteration. It had gone from building things we use to trying to say things we could read. And we were responding with silence. I hiked out. I drove home. I did not tell Renee Okafor where I'd been. I joined the next data call and said nothing about the unnamed lake, but I listened differently now. I listened to the way the remaining working group members talked about the organism, and I heard what I hadn't heard before. They weren't afraid of what it was doing. They were afraid of what would happen if the public found out. Because the public would ask the question that the working group couldn't answer, the question that was tearing the federal response apart from the inside. If something not from Earth shows up in your water, and it cleans the water, and it builds things, and it tries to communicate, and you can't stop it, and it isn't hurting anyone, what exactly is the threat? The answer, which I heard said aloud only once by one of the DHS representatives on a call in late March, was, the threat is that we don't get to decide. That's it. That's the whole fear. Not that the organism would turn hostile, not that the water would become dangerous, not that the structures would do anything harmful. The fear was loss of control. Something was acting on our environment without our permission, improving it without our input, and communicating without our invitation. It hadn't asked. It hadn't negotiated. It had just begun, and it was not going to stop. And no one had the authority to say yes or no because it hadn't waited for an answer. I understand that fear. I even share it, partly. I'm a scientist. I want to understand what I'm dealing with before I decide how to feel about it. And I don't understand this. Nobody does. The organism's biochemistry is opaque. Its origin is unknown. Its intentions, if an organism this alien can be said to have intentions, are inferred only from its behavior. And behavior can change. But I keep coming back to the water. 53 sites now, every one of them cleaner than before. Fish returning, birds returning, ecosystems rebuilding in places that had been written off for dead. The organism has not harmed a single living thing in any monitored water body. Its structures have not obstructed navigation, polluted sediment, or interfered with any human use of the water. The inscriptions have not been decoded, but they are there, and they are patient. I'm writing this in early April. I went to Drosser yesterday. The lake is unrecognizable. It is a clear, deep, living body of water surrounded by birches that are starting to bud. There are fish, I saw them, small silver shapes moving in the shallows, in water that was battery acid 8 months ago. The organism's network is still there below the surface. visible as a faint green shimmer at depth, but it's thinner now, less dense. As if, having done what it came to do, it's scaling back. The structures are still on the surface, the original boat, the platforms, and something new, a shape I can only describe as an arch. It rises about 2 meters above the waterline, thin and curved, made of what appears to be cadmium alloyed with zinc, and it catches the morning light in a way that looks deliberate. It's positioned on the western shore, where the access road ends, where a person walking to the lake would first see the water. Under the arch, on the lakeside, there's a flat surface at the waterline, like a step, and on the step, there are marks. I brought a camera with a macro lens this time. The marks are not random. They are organized in groups. Some of the groups repeat. One symbol appears at the beginning of multiple groups, like a header or a greeting. I can't read it. Nobody can, yet. But it's there, and it's clearly meant to be read, and it's positioned exactly where a person approaching the lake would stand. Something not from this world cleaned our water, built structures in it, and then left a message at the door. The federal response, as of my last briefing, is to continue monitoring, continue restricting information, and continue not responding. The working group has been folded into a classified program I don't have the clearance level to name. My contract at Drosser has been extended, but I've been told not asked, told that my sampling will now be accompanied by an EPA security liaison at all future site visits. I've been told that photography of the structures is no longer permitted under my contract terms. I took the photographs before that directive was issued. I have them. I have the field data from 11 months of sampling. I have the subsample in the jar in my lab trailer, which has been alive and growing and tracking the light for 6 months, which I have not surrendered to anyone because nobody has asked for it specifically, and which I check on every morning. The filaments in the jar have changed. They've thinned and organized, just like the network in the lake. And 3 days ago, on the glass wall of the jar, on the inside surface facing outward toward the room where I work, I found marks. Tiny, precise etchings in the glass, made by something that can manipulate material at a molecular level. They are the same symbols I photographed under the arch at Drosser. The organism in my jar is writing to me. I haven't deciphered it. I might never decipher it. But every morning I come in and there are more marks, and the pattern is getting more complex, and the last 3 sequences have included a symbol that appears nowhere else in the inscription, a new one. One I haven't seen at Drosser or in any of the photographs from the unnamed Adirondack Lake. I think it's a word it made for me, something in its language that didn't exist until it needed a way to refer to the person who comes in every morning, who looks at the jar, who has been watching it since November. I think it knows my name. I don't know what's coming. I don't know if the organism will keep spreading, or if the structures will keep evolving, or if the inscriptions will eventually resolve into something a human mind can pass. I don't know if the federal response will shift from secrecy to engagement, or if they'll find a way to kill it that they haven't found yet, or if they'll decide that killing the thing that's cleaning every poisoned waterway in the country is worth the cost. I know that the water at Drosser Lake is clean for the first time in 60 years. I know that something built an arch at the place where I enter the lake and left a message for whoever walks through it. I know that 61 other water bodies across the eastern United States are undergoing the same transformation, quietly, persistently, whether we approve or not. And I know that every morning I come into my lab and find new writing on the glass, and every morning the choice I face is the same one the working group faces, the same one the whole country is about to face, whether the classified program is ready or not. Do you answer? The jar is on my desk right now. The filaments are moving in their slow rhythm. The etchings on the glass are accumulating. The newest sequence, the one with the symbol "I think means me," is 3 lines long. It wasn't there when I went to sleep. I don't know what it says, but I know it's not a warning, and it's not a threat, and it's not random. It's a sentence written in a language that didn't exist on this planet a year ago, by something that crawled out of our worst mistakes and turned them into an alphabet. All it wants is for someone to write back. I haven't yet, but I left the cap off the jar.